Welcome back. It's Friday. You're with Mr. H on A-Level Tech. It's the best thing in the world, man. Oh, love this thing. Best present ever from my stepdaughter. Anyway, let's get into it. We're back with 116. We're talking about steering and suspension. And I got a request from a few of you on a little further of an explanation on ball joints and what kind of ball joints go with what kind of suspension. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to take a look at two vehicles. So we're going to look at this Impala. We're also going to look at this S10. And we're going to look at two different types. So we have McPherson Strut on this one, and then we have short arm, long arm, or SLA on that one. So we'll talk about four different terms. So we're going to talk briefly. I actually have the textbook out, so in case you want to follow along, you can actually go in the Cengage in the textbook. It is chapter 63 in the textbook. If you want to do a little more further research to understand what we're going through in 116, that'll help you out. Once again, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button. Also hit the like. Come on. You know you like me by now. You might as well like the video. It's Friday, just do it. Well, Friday for me. I don't know when you're watching this. I guess that's the thing about a YouTube channel. You can watch whenever you want, so it's not far away from you guys. Unless you actually watch it today. Anyway, let's go over to the S10, shall we? Okay, so if we're going over the S10, here's what we're looking at. Right off the bat, we're looking at short arm, long arm suspension. Now, what short arm, long arm suspension, or SLA, means is the upper control arm is actually shorter. Oh, it's moving on its own. Okay, got a ghost in the shop. The upper control arm is actually shorter than the bottom control arm, and you can tell that visibly too. So you see that this small control arm, yes, it's angled down, but it is much smaller than the larger control arm underneath. So if you want to take a quick field trip with me, as long as I don't break that, stepdaughter would hate that. But we can tell that underneath here, this bottom control arm is massive. So we're talking the whole way over to the cradle portion of the frame, but you can tell that this one is much smaller. So I can do maybe a better view here. So short arm, long arm, short arm, long arm, short arm, long arm. Okay, so I'm going to put you guys back down. We're going to put you back down. Okay, so moving on, we want to know about ball joints. So on this style, we have two ball joints. We have an upper ball joint and a lower ball joint. I will make this very easy. So when you're talking about load carrying ball joint, so in the book, I'm pretty sure they're going to call it a load carrier, but a load carrier ball joint is the one that carries the weight of the vehicle, or the sprung weight of the vehicle. The easiest way to find out which ball joint is the load carrying ball joint is to look for where the spring is placed. Where is that spring placed on the vehicle? As far as if it has an upper or lower control arm, what's the spring pushing down on? Because that control arm's job is to support the entire weight of the vehicle. And what I mean by support the entire weight, remember, the whole purpose of the spring is to hold the ride height of the vehicle. And it also holds all the sprung weight of the vehicle as well. So whatever the spring is pushing down on as far as a control arm goes, that's going to be the load carrying ball joint. So I could tell you right off the bat, the coil spring is right in the middle, but it's actually pressing down on the lower control arm. So what's that mean? That means that this bottom ball joint is the load carrying ball joint. And if you need an actual visual representation to see what that looks like, we can see right here that here's the spring, and it's actually sitting in a perch built into the lower control arm. So that means that this ball joint is the load carrying ball joint, because that's carrying the load of the vehicle. It's supporting the weight of the vehicle. So I don't know if you can see, it's kind of dark, but you can see the spring. There's actually a built-in perch on this bottom control arm. So that's all the sprung weight. What does that mean? That means if I'm taking apart this assembly, I got to be very careful, because just like when you were at an engines class and you were taking apart the valves, even though this suspension is relaxed, if you remember when you were taking the valve springs out, you need a valve spring compressor, even though those valves were closed, that spring was under tension. just like this one's under tension. So for a load-carrying ball joint, I'm going to sit this again. For a load-carrying ball joint, let's say I'm disassembling the suspension, I got to do a couple of things first. I might have to set jack stands underneath to support the weight of the vehicle, like it was actually sitting on the ground, or I might have to actually have a jack underneath the control arm while I am disassembling the spring and the shock itself. What would happen if I were to break this taper loose with the ball joint? This arm would immediately swing down and that spring would launch. And these wouldn't save me either. If you've ever seen a spring of that magnitude, now just think, your engines, neon engines, those springs went far. Imagine the force of one of these springs catching it to the face. Don't want it, a lot of paperwork. So for that, you would actually want to support the lower control arm because it is the sprung weight. It is holding the vehicle's weight. Even when it is in this format right here, it's still sprung. Otherwise, if it wasn't, I could just take this spring right out with my hand. It's still sprung. So I would have to support that lower control arm. Any load-carrying ball joint, you want to make sure that you are doing the proper steps and following manufacturer's procedures when you're either removing that ball joint or breaking that pressed taper on the steering knuckle. Whatever you're doing, that's an important one. Now let's talk about the other one. Let's talk about the follower. A follower ball joint is one that does not support the weight of the vehicle. It is just there to hold the alignment and follow through with whatever movements the suspension is making. Very much like we have the pitman arm on a steering box, and then you have an idler arm. He just copies Big Brother. He's just going to do whatever he's going to do. This is more of a reaction control arm. So let's say if I were to undo this top ball joint, since it's a follower, boom, break the taper loose and nothing happens. It's just a follower. Remember, this guy is the sprung weight of the vehicle. If I were to take this off, this arm wouldn't fly off or, do anything extreme. I'd break that taper and I could pretty much take this arm and wiggle it up and down. It's just a follower. It's not supporting the weight of the vehicle. So for these, this is not as dangerous of an arm as the lower arm would be. Same with if it wasn't spring. Let's say if it was a four-wheel drive model, since the spring is right behind this spindle, that would be replaced with a torsion bar that goes all the way to the suspension, not the suspension, but the transmission mount, where it holds the mount. So I'd have a torsion bar, because this would not be here. I would actually have an axle, a CV axle, coming through the other side if it was four-wheel drive. That's another way you can tell with trucks. If it's two-wheel drive or four-wheel drive, a lot of the times with a two-wheel drive truck, you'll see the spring on a perch underneath that lower control arm. If it's four-wheel drive, a lot of the time, unless it's modified, you're going to see a torsion bar instead. So that's one way. It's kind of a giveaway. But with modern vehicles, we've gotten around that, so it's not always true in that case. Now, so we have a follower, which is not supporting the weight of the vehicle. It's just there to make sure everything stays in place and holds the alignment. Another tidbit, for this one, since we're talking about camber and caster also, I talked about how some upper control arms have adjustments. Well, this one's not eccentric, this one's not slider, but this one does have shims. And I don't know if it's going to be able to pick it up the camera or not. I think you can see them there. But here is the shims. There's shims here and there's shims here. And I stack them or take them away to make this arm come in or out, or this side come in or out, and that side come in or out. So these are actually shims. So you take them out, put them in, and then you tighten the bolts on either side to adjust camber and caster. Now, there's two other terms. I gotta double check to make sure I label them right. Okay, tension loaded and compression loaded. Tension loaded and compression loaded. So for the book, when we talk about compression and tension loaded, a nice way to look is, it's actually figure 6341 in chapter 63 in the book. But with a tension loaded ball joint, you're gonna have the knuckle above the control arm. So this steering knuckle, the ball joint on the control arm is facing up. So if you took this control arm off, okay, here's a ball joint, the ball joint itself is sticking up, and then the knuckle would actually sit on top. With that being said, that would be a tension loaded, because remember, this control arm, if it wasn't for everything tied down, this control arm would want to go boom, swing out, and the spring would be loaded and want to shoot out. That's tension, so that's pulling the ball joint apart. Since that's sprung weight, it's trying to pull that ball joint, so that's tension on the ball joint. It's trying to pull that joint apart. That's how it would wear over time, is it would just wear back and forth, but it's tension. It's trying to pull that ball joint out of the joint. Now, What is compression? So a compression or a load carrying, depending on what you got, that is a ball joint in the control arm that's actually facing down, and the knuckle is actually placed underneath. So just think of this, control arm where the ball joint actual stud is pointing up. Okay, that's tension. If you have a control arm and the ball joint is facing down, that's compression, because that's going to be actually pushing that joint together. That's pushing that ball joint together. So that would be a tension loaded ball joint. Now, let's quickly, because I'm running a little low on time, but let's look at the McPherson Strut setup on this Chevy Impala, shall we? So this is an 05 or an 06 Chevy Impala, and I'm getting wrapped around in cables. This is McPherson Strut. So what I have is, here's my invisible caster line. I can't really tell, but the way this whole assembly tilts, whether forward or back, that's my caster line. That's how we pivot back and forth. Like I said, you're not going to be able to really tell, but this does tilt back a tiny bit. So it pivots on this imaginary line, going from the top of the strut to the bottom of the ball joint. I only have one ball joint on this one, and it's the bottom control arm. So of course that has to be the load carrying ball joint, because here's my strut assembly, so the spring and the shock all built in one. That's holding the weight of the vehicle, and I only have one ball joint, so that is the load carrying ball joint. And because it actually is facing up, that is going to be, it's going to be, I'll leave that up to you to figure out. Control arm stud is facing up. Anyway, this is a different style. I only have one control arm. If I was going to adjust camber on this one, these two bolts right here, sometimes you have a little wiggle room in between, but most of the time I'm going to put a cam eccentric bolt in its place. Most of these cars from factory, they just come the way they are. And as they wear, then you have to switch out components to actually adjust camber caster. But toe, you can always change. For this one, I have a steering rack. So rack and pinion, because that's the easiest to install. I would not have the room to put a steering gear in this, as well as I don't have frame rails to actually attach the steering gear to. Nothing beefy enough. So steering rack for this one, the S10 had a steering gear parallelogram setup with a center link and then tie rods and an idler. So for this type, only one control arm, one bottom control arm, a McPherson Strut, which the definition of a McPherson Strut is a strut assembly that only has one lower control arm and one low carrying ball joint. Does not have any other control arms. If it does, it's a modified McPherson Strut, but this is a general McPherson Strut setup. So I have a strut, which is the spring and the shock all built in one that connects to the knuckle and then to the ball joint itself, which means this whole entire assembly pivots. I have a top hat on here that actually has bearings in it on the top hat, and that allows this whole entire assembly to pivot. I'm pretty sure the steering wheel is going to be locked, but that's how the pivots, the whole entire thing pivots. So that's a brief explanation on those four terms. I hope this helps you guys out as far as the questions you had earlier. Like I said, chapter 63 explains a little more on that, but I hope you liked the video. There's going to be plenty more to follow, and if it's Friday for you, just understand it's Friday for me right now. So happy Friday. Have a good weekend. This is A-Level Tech. See you later.